Dork in Disguise, Chapter 2. Jerry walked down the corridor on the ground floor and squinted up at the room numbers as passed. The registration materials that had come in the mail said that his homeroom was room 112, with Mrs. Barnaby. He found the classroom and walked in. The seats were nearly all taken, but Jerry found a desk near the back. The teacher leaned against her desk and chatted with some girls in the front seats. "Okay, folks," the woman said after the bell rang. "This is homeroom, and I'm Mrs. Barnaby. Are you all in the right place?" No one said they weren't, so she continued. "Let's see who's here." She took roll, then handed everyone their class schedules and locker assignments. "You'll each have a partner," she said. "Now, if you follow me, we'll go to the locker area down the hall, and you can practice opening your lockers. If you have any trouble, ask me for help. If not, come on back here when you're done and wait for the others." Mrs. Barnaby led everyone down the hall. Jerry's was the locker on the very end. A blonde kid stood there, turning the combination lock. "Hi," Jerry said. "You got a locker 100 too?" The kid looked at him. "Yeah, I guess we're sharing it." He opened the door. Inside were 2 shelves and 2 coat hooks. "You want the top shelf or bottom?" Jerry asked. The kid shrugged and leaned against the wall next to the locker. "I don't care." Jerry realized that a cool guy wouldn't care which shelf he had. "Me either," he said. "Well, we got it open." "Mission accomplished." The kid stared at him with clear blue eyes. "So you got a name?" "Jerry." Jerry had a feeling it might be cooler just to give him his first name. That's the way he went in some cool teen horror movies he rented this summer. "I'm Craig." "So you want to go back?" Jerry asked. "What I want is to liven up this party, man," Craig said. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want to stir things up. See some action," Craig smirked. "Follow me." Jerry's instincts told him to stay put, but he knew if he did that, he'd blow his cover. Craig would think he was a dork. So Jerry followed him, and to his surprise, Craig walked back to their homeroom. They were the first people to return. The room was empty. "Come on," Craig said. "We got to work fast. What are we doing?" Craig picked up a desk and turned it upside down. Hurry, before someone comes." Jerry stared at him. Was he kidding? Jerry wished he could just turn around and leave, but how could he risk looking like a wimp? He figured he'd better play along. He shrugged, picked up the nearest desk, and set it down on his side. Craig kicked over the wastebasket and turned over Mrs. Barnaby's chair. He picked up papers on her desk and tore them in half and threw them on the floor. Then he wrote on the chalkboard, "The Phantom Tornado Strikes." Jerry opened his mouth to tell Craig he'd misspelled phantom, then realized a cool guy might not care how to spell it. He closed his mouth again. In a half-minute, the room was a disaster. Jerry began to sweat as he took in the damage. Half the desks were toppled over, and everything that had been piled on them was strewn on the floor. A mug full of pencils from Mrs. Barnaby's desk and all the erasers from the blackboards had been tossed around the room. Wood shavings from the pencil sharpener were scattered across the floor like confetti. "One last thing," Craig said. To Jerry's amazement, he opened Mrs. Barnaby's desk drawer and pulled out a box of tacks. He turned it over, and the tacks rained down on Mrs. Barnaby's desk, her overturned chair, and the floor. Jerry wished he had done anything other than come back with this maniac. Turning over a chair or two was one thing, but this vandalism, pure and simple. Craig ran back to the middle of the room just as the first 4 students returned. "Gee, what happened?" said the ponytailed girl, stopping in the doorway. "Wow," her friend said. The other 2 kids surveyed the damage with their open mouths. Jerry's locker partner plastered an innocent look on his face. "It was like this when we walked in, right?" He looked at Jerry. Yeah," Jerry said. He could feel the heat rising in his face. He knew that turning red would give him away, but he couldn't stop it. Jerry picked up his own desk and set it up right. Then he sat down. "Look at the board," the ponytailed girl said. Her friend made a face. "What an idiot. He couldn't even spell phantom right." "I'm getting Mrs. Barnaby," the ponytailed girl said. She disappeared into the hall. Craig shot Jerry a grin. Jerry didn't smile back. Within a minute, Mrs. Barnaby stopped in the doorway, gawking. "Who did this?" she demanded. "It was like this when we got back from our lockers," Craig said. "What's your name?" she asked him, walking into the room. "Craig Fox," he said. "I was with the locker partner." He pointed at Jerry. "And you are?" Jerry had to clear his throat before his voice would work. "Jerry Flack." Mrs. Barnaby sent a girl to get the assistant principal. "This is outrageous," she said. "Everybody pick up your desks." The bell rang, and Mrs. Barnaby said, "You all must go to your first period class now. Craig and Jerry, Mr. Meyer, may send for you later." Jerry wondered if she knew the truth. Jerry got up and moved with the rest of the kids into the hall. He hurried away, hoping to avoid Craig, and climbed the stairs to his language art class. Knowing he needed to sit fairly close to see the blackboard, he picked the second seat in the middle row. Still shaken by the incident downstairs, he kept half an eye on the door, hoping that Craig wouldn't be in this class. One by one, the students came in and sat down. Jerry began to relax when the room was nearly full and Craig hadn't come in. His stomach executed a cartwheel, though. When Cinnamon O'Brien arrived, she took a seat in the back and began whispering to a girl who sat next to her. Gabe Marshall walked in, and Jerry heard giggles from the girls in the back. Brenda McAdams was the last student to arrive. She plopped down in the last empty seat right in front of Jerry. "Hi, Flack," she said. "Hi." It was good to see Brenda after the episode with Craig. Jerry was relieved to talk to someone who wasn't interested in making trouble. Brenda leaned closer and murmured out the side of her mouth, "Smart move, sitting close so you can see without your glasses." She gazed over Jerry's shoulder. "Guess who's sitting in the back? Cinnamon O'Brien." Jerry winced. He didn't want to talk to Brenda about Cinnamon now, when the other kids might overhear. He was glad when the teacher walked in from the hall and Brenda turned to face the front of the room. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Mrs. Robertson, and this is Period 1 Language Arts class. We'll all stay together for second period Social Studies, too." Miss Robertson was pretty small and not much bigger than Jerry. He had a hard time believing she was old enough to be a teacher. Miss Robertson took the roll and then told them about the stories and novels they would read in the papers they would write this year. She had a beautiful singing voice, nice, with lots of highs and lows. "I'd like us all to get to know one another," Miss Robertson said. She handed papers to the first people in each row. "Pass them back, please. These sheets have some fun questions. Fill in the answers, and then we'll divide into small groups and introduce ourselves." When Jerry got to his seat, he looked down the list of questions. The first ones were easy. Name, family members, pets, then came the rest. If you would like to be a person from history, who would you be? What is the craziest thing you've ever done? What's the funniest thing you've ever done? Jerry knew he'd have to be careful on this questionnaire. One slip and everyone would know he wasn't cool. He took out a number 2 pencil freshly sharpened that morning and set to work. The first 3 questions were no problem. Then came the harder ones. A person in history, Jerry thought. Who was really cool and dead? George Washington or Thomas Edison or Albert Einstein? None of those guys would score cool points with the cool kids. Jerry wrote Elvis Presley. What is the craziest thing you've ever done? Jerry wasn't sure he'd ever done anything crazy, so he'd have to make something up. He thought about it a minute, then wrote, I went hang gliding with my dog. Not bad. It had an element of danger, plus it was kind of cool that he took his dog along. The funniest thing he'd ever done. Jerry usually didn't do things that were very funny. He'd have to make this one up, too. After half a minute of thinking, he wrote, Once I met a famous football player and told him a joke that really cracked him up. No, that wouldn't work, Jerry thought. The kids would want to know which famous football player, and Jerry didn't know any. So Jerry erased a famous football player and wrote Leonardo DiCaprio. He had a joke all ready to tell in case anyone asked what he said to Leo. Jerry sat back and read over his answers. He'd done a good job. If he didn't know otherwise, he'd assume this was written by a cool guy with a very exciting life. After a few more minutes, Miss Robertson divided the class into 4 groups. Jerry's group met in the back of the room and included Brenda Cinnamon and the girl Cinnamon had whispered to before class started. Switch papers with the person next to you, said Miss Robertson, and introduce your partner to the group. Jerry's partner turned out to be Cinnamon's friend. Her name was Robin Hedges. He looked at her paper. She had some good answers, but they paled in comparison to his. Meanwhile, Robin was reading Jerry's paper. Her eyes widened as she looked up at him. You really met Leonardo DiCaprio? Cool. Yeah, well, Jerry smiled modestly. He was off to a great start. When it was time to introduce their partners, Jerry's stomach filled with butterflies. He was going to have to introduce Robin, and Cinnamon would be watching him. He'd have to be careful. You only get one chance to make a first impression. He'd read that somewhere, and its meaning loomed large in his mind. Brenda was first. She introduced a guy named Scott Perkins, who said he'd be Abraham Lincoln from history, that he'd once entered a crazy frog jumping contest, and the funniest thing he'd ever done was write, "Wash me, you dirty scumbag," on someone's filthy car. Scott introduced Brenda, who said she'd be the scientist Madame Curie from history. The craziest thing that she'd ever done was dress as a flapper for Halloween, and her funniest experience was trying to wake up her sister when she was so sound asleep she wouldn't wake up. That was funny, Robin asked, frowning. Yeah, Brenda said. See, she was like this rag doll, a floppy dead weight. I couldn't stop laughing. Robin rolled her eyes at Cinnamon, who grinned back at her. Everyone in the group took turns until only Jerry and Robin and Cinnamon and her partner were left. Robin introduced Jerry. When she read that Jerry went hang gliding with his dog, Cinnamon laughed. Then Robin read his answer to the last question. Cinnamon gasped. You met Leonardo DiCaprio? What did you say to make him laugh? Jerry's heart stopped for a moment. Cinnamon had spoken to him, 12 whole words, and they were now inevitably stamped on his brain. He'd remember them forever. Abruptly, Jerry realized those words had formed two questions, and Cinnamon was waiting for an answer. His heart started again. It was now pounding away in his chest. His fingers tingled. Jerry glanced down at his hands and stared at them in horror. His fingernails and knuckles glowed white. He had the edge of his desk in death grip. He dropped his hands into his lap. Well, think, he hollered silently at himself. He scanned his memory for details from his cool research. I was playing in a band at the 4th of July celebration, and Leo was making a movie nearby, and he stopped to listen. He came over and talked to me after we played our set. It was a great lie, considering his brain was whirring out of control, like a windmill in a tornado. Cool, Cinnamon said. What was the funny story? Jerry flattered. What was it? His mind went blank. He just thought of it a second ago. Oh, okay, I got it now, he said. What do you get when you cross a Doberman with a lassie dog? What? Cinnamon asked, grinning. Just, Jerry flattered. What was the punchline? He was so nervous. Come on, brain. What was it? So what already? Asked Robin, frowning. You mean you can't remember it? I'll think of it in a second, he said meekly. Oh yeah, he laughed with relief. I remember now. What do you get when you cross a Doberman with a lassie dog? A dog that bites you in the leg, then runs to get help. But his timing had been really bad, and timing was important with all jokes. Brenda laughed heartily, but the others only smiled. Robin was obviously unimpressed. Okay, now you introduce me, she ordered. Jerry had to do better this time, much better. His future was hanging in the balance. This is Robin Hedges, Jerry said, pointing at her with his thumb. She has 2 sisters and a cat named Ralph. She'd be Marilyn Monroe from history. Jerry stopped and looked at her, his heart racing, and decided to risk making a snappy, cool comment. Yeah, Monroe was the epitome of cool. The word was out of his mouth before he could stop it. Me? Robin said scornfully. What's that? She was real cool, Jerry said lamely in a small voice. He felt the heat spread across his face. He stared at Robin's paper and read the rest in a fast jumble. Robin was a flower girl in her dance wedding when she was there, and she danced all the way down the aisle because she liked the music, and she put a salt in the sugar bowl at home, and her dad drank his coffee and spit it out all over the table. Jerry didn't look up, but he heard a few giggles. Robin frowned. Could you understand what he said? What about the coffee? Asked Cinnamon. Robin answered slowly with distinctly pronounced words. I put salt in the sugar bowl, and my dad